Get full episodes of The Damage Report as a podcast on iTunes and Android, and you can watch the live show every weekday on YouTube TV. What will the Democrats actually be doing with their new House majority when they take control of it in the very near future? Well, there is some indication coming out of what will be on the top of their agenda, and apparently some pro-worker policies, at least supposedly, are gonna be there. House Democratic aides involved in labor policy discussions say there are two specific issues near the top of the list: raising the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour within the next few years, and expanding overtime pay to millions more workers. The particular way that they might be doing the former is the Raise the Wage Act, which gradually raises the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour within 7 years, and then would tie the minimum wage to median wage growth for the overall workforce, which is not quite the same thing as cost of living increase, but it is at least something considering it doesn't adapt at all now.
Median wage growth.
Yeah, which we know the medium wage growth has been great.
Over
the last few decades.
Don't peg it to that, but I don't, in perpetuity, if it were a real, depends on who the plan is coming from, but don't just in perpetuity that second part of it. But the first part sounds very promising.
It does. I mean, it is one thing to say over a few years and another to say over 7 years. For me, 7 is not a few, it's 2.5 fews. But it is at least something, and it is a jumping off point. Now, we do have to acknowledge that they have the House, they don't have the Senate, and this is something that would benefit not CEOs, it would benefit the workers, so it's unlikely to actually pass. But still important that they do this sort of thing, and we're gonna have some other details as well. If you were in charge, what agenda would you actually set for the first few days? How would you take this new House majority and make the most of it?
Neutering of every male congressman. No, sorry, that's oh, I forgot what show I was on. No, I mean, the interesting thing that has been happening now in Congress, right? I don't know what I would do, but we see where progressives in Congress are going, right? Something not everyone knows about is that there is a Congressional Progressive Caucus that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is now part of. They every year put out a budget, they put out priorities. Hey, let's reduce military spending by this much. Let's increase healthcare spending, assistance for veterans or help with the VA. They put out a really progressive budget every single year. And I think we on the left kind of tend to imagine that people in Congress aren't doing that hard work, but they are. It's just that they don't have clout and seniority in Congress. Well, they have seniority, but they're not Pelosi or Schumer, right? Those two are not on the Congressional Progressive Caucus. AOC is. She had watching her Instagram story, she had a orientation to be part of the CPC. So I think we have to take our cues from them, and I'm sure it's going to be around expanding Medicare, protecting Medicare, and raising the minimum wage. I'm interested to see what, people like Pelosi and Schumer, how they respond to that.
Yeah, and in addition to the seniority, which is important, also, I would argue that in the past, they haven't had much media that gave a damn what they were working on.
Exactly.
Like they could have a budget, okay, but if nobody ever hears about it outside of the caucus, then it doesn't really get much traction. I'm hoping, I mean, look, they've got us and other online media outlets. I'm hoping that some of the mainstream media, if only to provide a contrast to Donald Trump and the Republicans, might now be willing to actually do it. After reporting on baby theft and Muslim bans for 2 years, hey, let's talk about something a little bit more optimistic. There's actually people pushing for positive change for actual Americans. That would be great. I don't know if I should really get my hopes up there, but that would be great. Some other things that they're attempting to work on, that same law that we were talking about, the Raise the Wage Act, would also phase out the lower minimum wage for restaurant servers and other tipped workers, which is currently $2.13 an hour, which I used to make. And employers would no longer be allowed to pay some disabled workers less than the minimum wage. House Democrats also plan to use their oversight power to investigate some controversial moves by the Department of Labor, including efforts to allow employers to keep workers' tips and to permit teens to do more hazardous work in apprenticeship programs. Yeah, the keeping the workers' tipsing was the most blatantly pro-management move I think I've seen out of the Department of Labor, that they can just rob the servers that they're managing. And it got a little bit of media coverage, but unfortunately, like obviously people who make the tips care about that, but it didn't really get a lot of traction outside of that.
No, and the tipped wage workers, eliminating the lower, sort of like that $2.13 minimum wage for tipped workers is huge. If that happened nationally, that would mean so much for working people, especially women in the workforce, in the restaurant industry. And the Restaurant Opportunity Center has been working all over this country on ballot measures and in state assemblies to pass something similar to that, and they've had some successes. But if they did it nationally, that would mean a lot. And this is the whole thing. I think we forget it. For those people who never worked in the restaurant industry, for example, California and New York, the minimum wage for a restaurant worker is the same minimum wage as anything else, right? But people still tip 15, 20%. But you go to a place like, I don't know, Iowa, or I'm just gonna name a random state, which I imagine doesn't have that.
We don't know for sure.
We don't know for sure, fact check. But $2.13 an hour is pitiful. And then of course, if you allow, or if it's easy for your employer to keep your tips for you, like it's ripe for sexual abuse, assault, and
harassment.
Harassment, exactly.
Yeah, and understand, as someone who worked for tips for a number of years, that $2.13 an hour becomes zero because you just pay your taxes on, like effectively all the taxes on your tips just get deducted out of that, which means at the end of the week, you literally get no paycheck whatsoever, or $3 or something like that. So this would be a good change as well. So I did ask my followers on Twitter what they would want to be the first bill put forward by House Democrats now that they have the majority. And I was surprised both by some of the things that were suggested, but also the diversity of different things. There were a lot of concerns. I mean, some things popped up most often. This is based on statistical analysis that I did by just casually browsing through. So Medicare for All was probably the most common. $15 an hour minimum wage was right up there similarly. I would say drastic action on climate change, like the Green New Deal, was actually, thankfully, and that might be just because they're my followers that they care so much about that. I hope that Americans generally do. But what was interesting is there was also a lot of talk of like protecting the Mueller investigation, investigating Donald Trump. That wasn't in the top 5 necessarily, but it was commonly coming up. It's something that I think gets derided quite a bit, but at least on political Twitter, which I constantly point out is representative of nothing but political Twitter, that is a thing that people are thinking about.
No, I think listen, I think it's about offense and defense. And I think you have to have some offense, you have to have a positive vision, hence, reforms around climate change. I would also wanna see gun reform in there. I think this week has been heinous in terms of, you look at Thousand Oaks suffering, a murderer who killed 12 people. Then that evening of the vigil, people are evacuating from climate change induced or bolstered climate change, forest fire, excuse me. So, but then the defense, you got to actually hold the president accountable. And now that the House and Democrats are in a position to do so, I want to see it.
Yeah, and we have to remember, of course, the Tree Life synagogue shooting, which, I mean, so we only can hold one shooting really in our head. Like, I'm gonna forget the one that came before that. But that was like 8 days ago. Like, it was not a long time ago. And in terms of, I'm glad that you said offense, defense. There are some people who say, I don't think you should talk about X topic because that will not sway voters in the next election. That is not the only reason you pursue something, whether publicly or behind closed doors. There's a lot of things that we gotta get done, and it is not gonna be determined just by what some people in a diner in Iowa think is the most important topic.
I think we have to stop thinking in this, like, what's gonna isolate people, what's a losing issue, and sort of like only relying on polls and I think it's a package. It's a complete vision. And what is the Democrats and what is a progressive vision that encompasses all of these things?
Yeah, exactly. You can do both. You don't have to, like for instance, we're going from our first block is the fight for increased minimum wage. The second block is going to be protecting the Mueller investigation. Proof that you can do both. Thank you very much for watching this clip from the Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.